want to start with September of 1837. And this was a time in church history when the church was established in Kirtland, Ohio, but Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Vincent Knight, and William Smith took a trip to Missouri to help establish the church out there. This little diagram I'm going to show you now shows the locations that they went. And along the way, they said that they had several meetings in these places, and they were attended with good success and generally allayed the prejudice and feeling of the people, which is kind of cool. By the way, I want to point out that this is a similar route that they took during Zion's Camp in 1834. Many of you may know that when they stopped at the Illinois River there, or that maybe is Upper Mississippi River, on June 4th, Joseph Smith wrote a letter to his wife Emma and described where they had been traveling here. And he said they'd been wandering over the plains of the Nephites, recounting occasionally the history of the Book of Mormon, roving over the mounds of that once beloved people of the Lord, picking up their skulls and their bones as a proof of its divine authenticity. So that was 4 years previously in 1834. But now here in 1837, they were going over those same plains of the Nephites, and they were having these town meetings, and they made this really interesting comment in the report. They couldn't write about it in this issue, but they wanted to close after naming a few questions which are daily and hourly asked by all classes of people whilst we are traveling. We will answer them in their next. So this was a letter that they wrote back to Kirtland, and they said, every day, every hour, people are asking us these questions by everybody. And they made a list of 20 questions. We're only going to talk about one today, but number 4 says, how and where did you obtain the Book of Mormon? Here's some of the other questions that people were asking. Number 10 was Joe Smith, the money digger. 16, if the Mormon doctrine is true, what have become of all that have died since the days of the apostles? And number 20, what are the fundamental principles of your religion? So some of these questions you may or may not be familiar with. The ones I've highlighted were some of the better known, I guess, today, because people have written about them. How and where did you obtain the Book of Mormon? The answer, Moroni, the person who deposited the plates from whence the Book of Mormon was translated, in the hill in Manchester, Ontario County, New York, being dead and raised again therefrom, appeared unto me and told me where they were, and gave me directions on how to obtain them. I obtained them and the Urim and Thummin with them, by the means of which I translated the plates, and thus came the Book of Mormon. So that's the single most clear, unambiguous, precise explanation that Joseph Smith gave about how and where he obtained the Book of Mormon. The last question that Joseph listed here was, what are the fundamental principles of your religion? And he said, the fundamental principles of our religion is the testimony of the apostles and prophets concerning Jesus Christ, that he died, was buried, and rose again the third day and ascended up into heaven. And all other things are only appendages to these which pertain to our religion. I highlighted that one to reemphasize the point that those are the most fundamental principles of our religion, is Jesus Christ as our Savior. Now, let's look at this a little more carefully, this answer that Joseph gave. I've highlighted it in 3 different ways. The gold text talks about the plates, the green talks about Cumorah, and the blue talks about the Urim and Thummim. So let's just go through a little more slowly to start off with. He said the answer to the question of how and where he obtained the Book of Mormon was that Moroni deposited the plates from whence the Book of Mormon was translated. So Joseph right there is making clear, explicit, unambiguous that the Book of Mormon was translated from the plates that Moroni deposited. Okay. And then in the hill in Manchester, which is the hill Cumorah. And if you remember when Moroni first appeared to him, Joseph wrote here, told me where they were and gave me directions how to obtain them. Lucy recorded that when Moroni first came, he identified the hill as Cumorah. And that's how Joseph knew it was the hill Cumorah before he even translated the plates. But then the next part says, I obtained them, meaning the plates, and the Urim and Thummim, which was with them. So again, here Joseph is explaining the Urim and Thummim was with the plates in the hill Cumorah. And then he said, by the means of which I translated the plates, and thus came the Book of Mormon. You can see why so many people are asking about the origin of the Book of Mormon, because this book, Mormonism Unveiled, had become fairly popular among Christian ministers, that they would share it around, and the stories flew that Joseph had not really translated any plates, but had used a stone and a hat. Now, this book also created another source of controversy, which was the Solomon Spaulding theory. And what they said in this Mormonism Unveiled book was, as I point out here, it was the theory that Solomon Spaulding wrote a novel about the origin of the American Indians, that Sidney Rigdon copied the novel, added a bunch of Christian themes and sermons, and then gave it to Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith read the Spaulding manuscript from behind a screen. That was the Solomon Spaulding theory. So Mormonism Unveiled talked about that quite a bit. So here's one of the ideas that lend support to the Spaulding theory, and that was the accounts that Joseph Smith was dictating from behind a screen. If you remember, Martin Harris talked about that he told Martin he wasn't allowed to see the plates or the Urim and Thummim, so he had to dictate from behind a screen. And that's what the veil in Mormonism Unveiled represented. He said, we're going to unveil this, or remove this curtain that Joseph Smith was dictating from behind, and present the Solomon Spaulding theory. So for many years in the church, actually for over 180 years, the idea that Joseph Smith was dictating the translation as he used the Urim and Thummim and the plates, in other words, he was reading the engravings on the plates and translating them, that was always depicted and taught in general conference and so on. This graphic here actually comes from the CES letter. And in the CES letter, they kind of condemn this. They say the church's honesty and transparency on display, because the next slide, they say this is what really happened, the stone and the hat. And so the controversy that Joseph Smith encountered in 1837 persists to this day. Nevertheless, this idea of the stone and the hat has gained a lot of momentum recently, and I want to discuss why that is. In fact, even at Education Week, there's an article about Education Week where they present Joseph Smith just dictating from a stone and the hat, not even engaging with the plates. The question is, how did Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery respond to these claims? And the answer is, you can read it right in the Joseph Smith papers. The same month that book Mormonism Unveiled was published, Oliver Cowdery wrote the first of 8 letters about church history, partly to clarify the record and to refute the claims of Mormonism Unveiled. The first one talked about the translation. These were the days never to be forgotten. To sit under the sound of a voice dictated by the inspiration of heaven awakened the utmost gratitude of this bosom. Day after day I continued, uninterrupted, to write from his mouth, as he translated with the Urim and Thummim, or as the Nephites should have said, interpreters, because that's how we used it in the text of the Book of Mormon, the history or record called the Book of Mormon. So right there, Oliver Cowdery refuted both the Spaulding theory and the stone and the hat theory. He said Joseph translated with the Urim and Thummim the record. So to reiterate what Joseph had already written in the preface that he translated from the plates, here Oliver Cowdery added his additional witness as the scribe who saw the whole thing. Also in 1837, Joseph Smith revised the Book of Mormon, and they published a second edition. And then they added a new preface here. It was, I think it was probably P. Pratt who actually published this edition. But it points out here, I'll just read with part of this preface. It says, individuals acquainted with book printing are aware of the numerous typographical errors which always occur in manuscript editions. It is only necessary to say that the whole has been carefully re-examined and compared with the original manuscripts by Elder Joseph Smith, Jr., the translator of the Book of Mormon, assisted by the present printer, Brother Oliver Cowdery, who formerly wrote the greatest portion of the same as dictated by Brother Joseph. So right here again, this is Parley Pratt, but this was the second edition of the Book of Mormon, and they are re-emphasizing that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon. as he claimed all along, of course. He didn't read the words off the stone in the hat. He didn't read the Solomon Spaulding manuscript. And in this case, again, as you can see, they put translated by Joseph Smith Jr., but they added this, the third edition, carefully revised by the translator. Why would Joseph make corrections to the Book of Mormon? As you know, he made quite a few corrections. And it makes sense that he would have gone back to correct it, because any translator would, as they would learn better grammar or think about how the translation had come across, they would realize that they could revise it and improve it. As a translator, he was entitled to do that. If he had read all the words off of a stone, theoretically, that would have meant that those words were precisely word for word what God wanted to be in the book. Joseph would have no justification or authority to change those words. But as a translator, he was entitled and authorized and empowered and so on to go in and revise it as he felt it was appropriate, which he did. And in 1842, Joseph wrote an article for the Times and Seasons called Church History, in which he was providing an outline, again, to correct misunderstandings that were floating around about the origin of the church. And in there, he talked about the origin of the Book of Mormon. And this is another passage that's important to focus on. He said, with the records was found a curious instrument which the ancients called Urim and Thummin, which consisted of two transparent stones set in the rim of a bow fastened to a breastplate. And then he wrote, through the medium of the Urim and Thummim, I translated the record by the gift and power of God. If you remember early on when I talked about Mormonism unveiled, there was the stone in the hat, Urim and Thummim, and the third one was the Solomon Spaulding theory. And the Spaulding theory had taken over. I mentioned that there are 5 books published in the United States, 1 in England, that articulated this Spaulding theory. Everybody assumed that was the explanation for the Book of Mormon. So after Joseph Smith died, when Oliver Cowdery rejoined the church, he reiterated his testimony. And one of the things he said was that Sidney Rigdon did not write it, Solomon Spaulding did not write it, but Joseph translated it, translated the record with the Urim and Thummim. So that was his last declaration, really, about how Joseph translated it. He expressly refuted the Spaulding theory once again. I think that was in 1858. It's hard for us in our day to think about how important the Spaulding theory was in the 1800s. But people, the media were all saying it was the Spaulding manuscript. The critics were saying that. The other ministers were saying that. It was kind of a universal consensus, even overseas, that the Book of Mormon came from this mysterious lost manuscript of Solomon Spaulding. And so when Emma and David Whitmer were asked about the Book of Mormon, they were in a tough situation, because if they, first off, David Whitmer wasn't a scribe, and he admitted he wasn't around much for the translation. But he said, I wasn't there most of the time, but I knew how it was done. That's how he put it. And he did describe one event that he attended. And that was where in the Whitmer home, they had if you've been, and those who have visited the Whitmer home know that most of the translation took place in the bedroom upstairs, where they have it set up now. But the downstairs had a big family room, and they had a dining table. And David Whitmer says on this occasion that members of the Whitmer family and the Smith family and maybe some friends were seated around the table. And Joseph Smith came down and had his hat. And I don't remember if didn't bring it up on the screen here, if he said he put a stone or a spectacle in there. But the idea was that this is where he put the stone in the hat and read words, put his face in the hat and read words and dictated words. And so the question is, was that event that he was describing the translation of the Book of Mormon, or was it something else? And until about 2 years ago, as near as I can tell, every historian who's looked at this just assumed that was a translation of the Book of Mormon, because Dave Whitmer said it was. But when you look at all the historical references and all the sources, no one wrote down what Joseph actually dictated on that occasion. People just said, well, he was dictating the Book of Mormon. Well, what was he dictating? Was he dictating Second Nephi, Omni? It had to be something from the place of Nephi, because that's what he was translating in Fayette. But nobody wrote down what he actually dictated. What I think is a likely possibility is that Joseph Smith was doing a demonstration. Because remember, he was commanded that if he showed the plates or the Urim and Thummim to anybody, he'd be destroyed. You know, Oliver Cowdery had to get special dispensation or special permission to attempt to translate. But other than that, nobody else had permission to see the Urim and Thummim or the plates. And so when they were translating the plates of Nephi in the Fayette home upstairs, there was a housekeeper assistant, young woman who was working in the Whitmer home. And she said that when Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery came downstairs, they were glowing, and it kind of freaked her out. She wanted to quit because she didn't know there was some spiritual thing going on. And people explained that they were doing the work of the Lord. They were translating an ancient record, but she wasn't satisfied. And apparently other people weren't either, because later on, there's a man named, I can't remember his name now, but he had interviewed David Whitmer, some of the others, and he said that Joseph had a seer stone. Everybody said he had a seer stone, but he only used it to satisfy what he called the awful curiosity of his supporters. This guy's name was Zenas Gurley, if you know church history. But he said that Joseph used that stone to satisfy the awful curiosity of his followers and his family and those around him. And that's what led me to think, well, maybe that's what he was doing on that occasion David Whitmer was present for. Joseph took the stone, put it in the hat, and he said, this is how the translation works, words to that effect. Because at that time, people were used to seer stones, clairvoyance, and so on, that would put a stone in a hat and dictate a message from a dead person or find something in a haystack or whatever. They would use that was a common practice. So Joseph could use that to teach the people how the translation was working, because he couldn't show them the actual Urim and Thummim. Joseph said when he first got the plates down in Harmony, the first thing he did was copy the characters, and he said, I translated them by means of the Urim and Thummim. So that tells us right there he was learning the language. And anybody can read that in the Pearl of Great Price today. It's still right in there. We can tell from that he was actually learning the characters. But what does that mean? And in our book, we did a comparison to the Rosetta Stone. I have a sample Rosetta Stone here that I keep at my desk all the time. It's kind of a paperweight that was uncovered in Egypt, and it has 3 languages on it. One of these Egyptian languages had never been deciphered, but by using the Greek and the other Egyptian language, they could compare and start cracking the code, so to speak. And so they could begin to understand, even though they didn't have a complete translation of all of it, they had enough that they could use to do it. And now scholars can read all these languages, no problem. And so I kind of see, if you look at the way they did this decryption, let's say, or decipherment of this unknown language, there would be a variety of ways to translate it. And ancient languages, particularly when there's a character, would typically have a variety of interpretations for one character. A character could be a paragraph, it could be a concept, it could be a particular noun. And so we don't know because we don't have access to the characters that are on the plates today. But just the fact that Joseph was translating characters tells us it was not an alphabet like we have, where we spell words with, A, B, C, D, but each character represented something. So that means that most likely there was a variety of meanings for each character. And the Urim and Thummim would give him a literal translation. Joseph Smith said explicitly that the title page was a literal translation from the plates. And that's significant for a couple of reasons. One, it tells us Joseph wrote that because he wanted to make sure that people knew he did not compose the title page. There had been a rumor that he had written the title page. It was part of the copyright application. And he said, no, it's not a modern writing. I didn't write it. It's a literal translation from the last leaf of the plates. And so Joseph knew what a literal translation was. He didn't say that about the rest of the Book of Mormon. He never said the entire Book of Mormon was a literal translation. And I've done a little analysis of the title page to show how it is different from the rest of the Book of Mormon. You can see why he would say that was a literal translation, where the rest of the Book of Mormon was not. It's more of a functional translation instead of a literal translation. So getting back to this Rosetta Stone, a literal translation of one of these languages into English wouldn't make sense to us. It'd be grammatically incorrect. So it's like those of you who may know German, in most German sentences, they put the verb at the very end of the sentence. And so you have to read the whole sentence before you know what the verb is. To them, that makes sense. To us, we can't translate it literally. We have to reconfigure it to make sense grammatically in English. And that's what we think Joseph had to do. The Urim and Thummim would give him a literal translation, but he would have to take that literal translation and convert it into English that would be familiar to his readers. Basically, 1800s Americans who were familiar with the Bible. The Urim Thummim would give him a literal translation, and then he would have to convert that into English, drawing on his familiarity with the King James Version and the writings of other Christian authors. Joseph Smith explained that that he had translated, as it says, by the gift and power of God, it caused to be written 116 pages, the which I took from the book of Lehi, which was an account abridged from the plates of Lehi by the hand of Mormon. The Lord had commanded him, after the 116 pages were lost and he tried to find them, he said, the Lord commanded I should not translate the same over again. So he was doing the translation. And then because they would, the people who stole the pages would publish the words differently. And he says, they would read contrary from that which I translated and caused to be written. So again, right here, 1830. And then the Lord said, in other words, if I should translate the same over again, so if he should translate it over again, they would change the words when they published them. What were Joseph and Oliver supposed to do? The first thing they did, Oliver addressed the publication with his statement, which is now in Joseph Smith History and the Pearl of Great Price, where he said, day after day I continued uninterrupted to write from his mouth as he translated with the Urim and Thummim, or as the Nephites should have said, interpreters, the history or record called the Book of Mormon. In February of 1835, a few months later, Oliver was publishing his account of Moroni's first visit to Joseph Smith, which he wrote with Joseph's assistance, and even put in there as an example when he was talking about what time Joseph Smith went to bed that night before Moroni came. He said, Joseph can't tell me exactly what hour it was. So they were having this dialogue about the account that Oliver was writing. And Oliver wrote, he, Moroni, said this history was written and deposited not far from that place, meaning Joseph's house, and that it was our brother's privilege, if obedient to the commandments of the Lord, to obtain and translate the same by the means of the Urim and Thummim, which were deposited for that purpose with the record. In 1835, the Doctrine and Covenants was published. Several of the revelations had been published in the 1833 Book of Commandments. Most of them were destroyed. There were a few copies around, but they had a book of Revelations that they had been written in. And so they made some editing changes when they published them in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. This is one of the most significant ones, because as you can see here in the 1833 Book of Commandments, it just said, behold, this is the Lord saying, I say unto you, Joseph, that because you delivered up so many writings which you had power to translate into the hands of wicked men. Now, leaving it that way left it a little bit vague. So in order to clarify the revelation and what everybody understood at the time the revelation was received, they edited and inserted this phrase by means of the Urim and Thummim. So it was clear to everybody that Joseph used the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates. In 1838, Joseph Smith again answered. I mean, it's amazing how many times he had to answer this, but here's another time where he says, how and where did you obtain the Book of Mormon? And he explains, Moroni came and he says, Moroni gave him directions on how to obtain the plates. Then he said, I obtained them, the plates, and the Urim and Thummim with them, by the means of which I translated the plates. And thus came the Book of Mormon. Later on in 1840, the third edition of the Book of Mormon was published, at least the third American edition. Right on the cover, it says, translated by Joseph Smith Jr., carefully revised by the translator. And then this is published in the Times and Seasons. And he explained that with the records, with the plates, was found a curious instrument which the ancients called Urim and Thummim, which consisted of two transparent stones set in the rim of a bow fastened to a breastplate. Through the medium of the Urim and Thummim, I translated the record by the gift and power of God. Well, let's take David Whitmer or Martin Harris and Emma Smith. They all claimed that they were present on at least part of the translation process. And they claimed they saw Joseph put a stone in a hat, bury his face in a hat, and dictate words. I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. I don't have any reason to think that they were lying about what they actually observed, because they said they saw him bury his face in a hat and dictate words. That's all fine with me. That's part of the demonstration process, in my view. But for them to say they observed the translation is taking it one step too far. These are just examples of the translation in harmony from Joseph Smith's own account, where he said he copied the characters, translated them. He received the Urim and Thummim back. He translated, Oliver Cowdery said he translated by the gift and power of God. Lucy Mack Smith described what happened in harmony and said he got knowledge through the Urim and Thummim as he applied them to his eyes to look on the record. So here's Joseph looking on the record with the Urim and Thummim. Again, he was translating by means of the Urim and Thummim. We can see right in the original manuscript that there was different spellings. Oliver was spelling words differently, what we would call misspell, although it wasn't necessarily a standard spelling at the time. But definitely there's spelling problems. There's a few lineouts where they had to make corrections. There were errors in the original manuscript, and we know that Joseph made changes later. I showed you in the 1840 and 1837 edition, where it said right in the preface that the translator made corrections and revisions. So the words that appeared on the Urim and Thummim would not have been the exact words for Joseph to dictate. Biblical scholar named Eugene Nida, who explained there's two ways you can approach translation. You can have a formal equivalence, which is a literalistic translation, or you can have a functional or dynamic equivalence where you're translating the meaning rather than the words. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of that, and then I'll explain or propose how we think the Urim and Thummim worked and why all of the accounts can be reconciled with this approach. First off, if you know French, here's a picture of cats. The French is il y a des chats à la chambre. And the formal translation into English would be it there has of the cats to the room, which doesn't make sense to us. If you do a functional translation, you would just say there are cats in the room. It doesn't exactly follow the French, but it follows a sense. It gives you the same meaning. And we see this in biblical translation all the time. Here's Strong's Concordance. It's a Greek word meaning to lead or to suppose. So you can see in the usage, it says you can say I lead, or I think, or I'm of the opinion, I suppose, consider. So there's variant translations of the same word in Greek. Joseph Smith, just before he died, he reemphasized this yet again as the translator when he said, by the gift and power of God, I translated the Book of Mormon from hieroglyphics. Why are there errors in the original manuscript? What we think happened, that's consistent with all the evidence, is that the Urim and Thummim wouldn't just work on its own. It wouldn't just give you words. It had to be looking at words and looking at the engravings. That's why the Lord told Joseph, translate the engravings on the plates of Nephi. So he got the abridged plates that he took to Harmony, translated all those except for the sealed portion. And when he was done, he gave them to the messenger who took those back to Cumorah. The messenger got the plates of Nephi from Cumorah because the Lord commanded Joseph to translate the engravings on the plates of Nephi. So the messenger took those plates to Fayette. That's why Joseph translated the plates of Nephi in Fayette. But the point is that he said, translate the engravings on the plates of Nephi. So he had to have the Urim and Thummim, and he had to look at the engravings he was supposed to translate. When he first translated the engravings that he copied, he said he copied the characters and translated the characters. So in other words, he used the Urim and Thummim to look at characters and got an English word or multiple words. A literal translation would not make sense in English. But that's what the Urim and Thummim would give him, was a literal translation. And that's why later on, in 1837 and 1840, as he went back revising the text, by then he had learned better grammar and maybe different vocabulary and so on. And so he would go back through and say, oh yeah, I remember this is how I thought it made sense, but I can make more sense of it now. as the translator. That explains why the errors on the original manuscript, and as well as why he corrected the text later. Because he, as the translator, was the best one to know what the original meaning was, and he could improve it as he revised it later on. Joseph was the translator. He wasn't an ancient person. He was living in 1829 when he translated this. So naturally, the King James language would be the language he would draw on to do a translation. There's no other way he could translate it other than to use the language he was familiar with. Naturally, he quoted and blended biblical passages because that's what he was familiar with. But there's a large portion of the Book of Mormon that is not biblical. There's a lot of, in fact, I added up, I think it was around 750 words that are nowhere found in the King James Version. Part of Joseph Smith's vocabulary or mental language bank was the writings of Jonathan Edwards. And Jonathan Edwards lived in the 1700s. Maybe many of you are not familiar with him, but he's a well-known Christian theologian, probably the most influential in America, in the United States anyway. He wrote a series of very influential books, gave lots of sermons, but in 1808, an 8-volume collection of his books was published. And it turns out it was on sale in the bookstore in Palmyra that Joseph Smith visited every week to get the newspaper for his father. As I've gone through Jonathan Edwards' writings, I found most of the terms and phrases that are non-biblical in the Book of Mormon, but they're found in the works of Jonathan Edwards. He would have studied or read or heard all these sermons from Jonathan Edwards that incorporated this language, not just the terms, but the phrases and even the concepts in some places. Jonathan Edwards wrote extensively about the future of the church, and he wrote that there would be a restoration, that it would be expand throughout the world, all these things that actually were fulfilled in the restoration. One simple example of this is the phrase, in other words. When I do my analysis on this, I look for words and phrases that are non-biblical. I put on here Old Testament 0, New Testament 0, Book of Mormon 13 instances, Doctrine and Covenants 23 instances, 1 in the Pearl of Great Price, and 83 in the works of Jonathan Edwards. The example I give here is from a letter Joseph Smith wrote, and which is now D&C 128. Now the nature of this ordinance consists in the power of the priesthood by the revelation of Jesus Christ, wherein it is granted that whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Or, in other words, taking a different view of the translation, whatsoever you record on earth shall be recorded in heaven, and whatsoever you do not record on earth shall not be recorded in heaven. It says this according to the account of Nephi, or in other words, I, Nephi, wrote this record. In other words, Urim and Thummin might have said something like, account of Nephi, let's say, or Nephi account wrote. How would I say that in English? I'm going to say this is according to the account of Nephi, but another view of the translation, to use Joseph's words, would be, I, Nephi, wrote this record. Someone who is writing this out would not write it this way, because they would just write it the way they meant it. Whether it was Mormon or Nephi or anyone would say, here's the account. Why would they add or in other words? But a translator would use in other words. About the establishment of the church in the Latter-day Saints, he didn't start with the first vision like we do today. He started with a brief relation of my experience while in my juvenile years, say from 6 years old, up until the time he received the first visitation. So what happened when he was 6 years old? Why would he start with that? Because he had that leg surgery. He had 3 years to recuperate when he had to be carried or use crutches. And so that's when he was reading. He was doing a lot of reading of Christian material, and we've discussed that. And then because he was unable to work on the farm even, he had plenty of time to read. We know he talked a lot about studying the scriptures even before Moroni came. As I mentioned here, he translated the plates into English using his own mental language bank, his vocabulary, syntax, etc. And we can see the influence of the King James Version with direct quotations and blending. But we can also see it in the influence of Jonathan Edwards. Here's a comparison between the King James Version and Jonathan Edwards. So Mosiah 18:21 says, having their hearts knit together in unity and love. If you go to the Bible, you can find their hearts, and then in Colossians 2:2, being knit together in love. But then you have to go to Psalms to find together in unity, and then you blend those two to get Mosiah 18. In other words, the passages from the Bible, if they were in Joseph's mind, he would come to his recollection or subconsciously, their hearts being knit together in love. And then he also remembers in Psalm, dwelling together in unity. But I feel like Jonathan Edwards, he had a much closer passage than the Bible does. Have their hearts knit together in love, which is closer, in unity and love. He connected those two together. So Joseph could have the love part as a connection. So that's just one example of many. God will cause his church to arise and shake herself from the dust and put on her beautiful garments, sit down on the throne, which that's some of the language from Moroni and so on. Joseph had studied the characters. Remember, he copied them. He translated them individually. He had the plates for a year before Oliver Cowdery ever arrived. So, and he had already translated 116 pages. So assuming that the same script was from, Mormon used the same script all the way through, and that Nephi used the same script on his own plates. Joseph was so familiar with them, he could just look at the character. He'd already translated those characters and read them off. And when Joseph looks at this, he could probably come up with 4 or 5 or 6 different ways of expressing that. And that's where it required the spiritual input to know which one was the best. Or is there a better way than the one I've thought of? And they worked from morning until night. And that was in the summer in New York. So they were long hours to do this. It wasn't just reading words that showed up. As soon as you accept that it's a translation, all this, even the anachronisms, all that stuff just goes away because it's a translation by someone living in the 1830s. He said, I translated the engravings on the plates. I translated the engravings with Urim and Thummin. And when you look at all the evidence, it corroborates that. But if you accept what he said, you understand why he went back in and made changes. You understand why there's non-biblical language from Jonathan Edwards. You understand why there's anachronisms. You understand why there's New Testament language. If he did what he said, what he produced is exactly what we would expect. For those who have questions, just go back to what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said, and that's where all the answers are.